Welcome back. This is week 9, lecture 1, the Reformation Program, Catechesis, and Education. Last week, I focused on the spread of Luther's ideas, the evangelical party's ideas, the spread and development of the Martinianer, the followers of Luther, both in terms of princes and city-states, or not city-states, but imperial cities. Um, and the propaganda campaign that went out with Luther's works, the images that were accompanied many of his works that were published, and the extent to which he dominated the media. And those printings were indeed intended for a broad, large audience. But this week, then the focus turns, at least in this lecture, first of all, to how, on the individual level, dealing with individuals, did the Reformation program seek to instill its ideals and its positions? How did that all work on the individual level? And then in the second lecture for this week, we'll go back, kind of step back and take a broader look again in terms of some of the political developments between Luther's stance at Worms and the Confession of Augsburg. Now, there are two readings assigned for this week. The first is Luther's Small Catechism, and I've posted that for you in a Word document. I think the syllabus gives you the URL where you can find it. I actually had some problems with that URL myself, but what I did was actually then cut and paste from the website, the Gutenberg Project website, I think it was, or Luther Project website. Anyway, the text and put it in a Word document for you. So it's right there in the module for week 9. The second reading is the Confession of Augsburg itself. And I've posted then, I think I also gave a URL on the syllabus for it, but I found a PDF of it on file or online. And so I actually posted the PDF of the Confession of Augsburg, the English translation, of course. So that is there in the module for week 9 too. So both readings for this week are easily available in the module for week 9, together with the PowerPoint presentations and the lectures. Of course, the lectures haven't been posted yet. I'll be posting this one as soon as I'm finished with it, and then I'll get to the next lecture as soon as I can. Anyway, so that's kind of the preface of what we're looking at. And the program to change individuals on the individual level was really twofold. And the first prong of it was catechesis, and the second prong was education. And those obviously are very closely related because catechesis is teaching. As I mentioned before, Augustine of Hippo wrote a work on teaching the unlearned, De Catechizandis Rudibus, and how do you teach the unlearned Christian doctrine, and what do they need to know? And that was the issue too we saw with my discussion of the catechetical program and endeavor in the later Middle Ages and the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. And Jordan of Quedlinburg's exposition on the Lord's Prayer was very much a part of that, in terms of that was one of the texts, the documents that everyone was just supposed to know. You're supposed to know the Lord's Prayer. You're supposed to know the Ten Commandments. You're supposed to know the Ave Maria. And you're supposed to know the Creed. Those were the big four. And I mentioned too, in discussing the late medieval catechetical endeavor, that there was no such thing as the catechism. That was a development that starts with Luther and Luther's small catechism, and then later his larger catechism, which is very similar. It's just a more extensive treatment. But we'll be talking about that very shortly. So that's what we're looking at today, and this really gets at the heart, in some ways, of the Reformation, because the intent was not simply to Luther's intent, I think the pastoral intent, the point of the theological positions, was not simply to break from Rome. That was important, at least for Luther after February of 1520, and some of the other reformers as well. It was not simply to assert the truth, Certainly, that's what they were doing and striving to do, and putting their lives on the line, literally, for doing that. But the whole point was to transform the hearts and minds of individuals, and to teach individuals what theological truth actually was, and what they needed to know, again, for salvation. That's what it comes down to it. We can say, fine, it was Luther's idea was justification by faith, and therefore you don't need to know anything else or do anything else, but that's not quite Luther's position either. I talked about the difference between Luther's understanding of extrinsic righteousness compared to the very strongly Augustinian position of Jordan and other late medieval Augustinians. There was two very much based on predestination and passive righteousness, but there the focus was then on intrinsic righteousness. Still, once you are predestined, once you know you are a child of God, then how do you live your life and how do you become sanctified? That sanctification process. So there was still a link between justification and sanctification for the late medieval Augustinian tradition, whereby first you're justified, justification by predestination and passive righteousness, and then that is allows for the beginning of the sanctification process, even though the sanctification process was not the basis of getting into heaven, so to speak. It was how to live a Christian life. Now that we know we're adopted sons and daughters of God, how do we live? With Luther, he completely divorced the two. He separated sanctification from justification, so that the two didn't really have any relationship together whatsoever. He will even say that explicitly when he makes comments like, we're no better than the papists. The papists are no better than we are in terms of how we live. The issue is one of justification. Now, the theology in the later Middle Ages that Luther was taught was kind of the inverse of the Augustinian position. It was justification being based on sanctification. So the whole point and the theology that Luther was reacting against was what he had been taught. And that was very much a process of first we have to be sanctified in order to become justified. That's what Luther attacked. And I argued that he didn't really know all that much about the entire medieval tradition, even with his theses against scholastic theology, when he says, as against the entire medieval tradition. He didn't, that was very much hyperbole, based on not that much knowledge, actually. And that's kind of a controversial thing to say, because that's, well, I won't go into all that, the historiographical debates that would, by Protestant scholars or by Luther scholars, they would say that's just a typical Catholic position to argue that Luther didn't know all that much. And for the Protestants, he was, Lutherans anyway, he was the almighty, all-knowing expert scholar that was more knowledgeable than anybody ever had been, basically. Those are kind of two extremes. And certainly I'm not putting forward the fact that Luther didn't know very much about late medieval theology based on Catholic polemics, but rather looking at what he cites, what he seems to be aware of, the fact that he thought passive righteousness, as he discovered it, was his own unique discovery that no one had ever seen before, since at least Paul. He later says, well, maybe Gregory of Rimini. We know that Luther became familiar with Gregory's work. Gregory was a 14th century Augustinian theologian, but not until 1519 is there real evidence that he knew Gregory. It's speculative whether he may have been aware of him before or not. He was probably aware of him, but my view is that what he knew about Gregory of Rimini before 1519 or so is what he read in Gabriel Biel, who cites Gregory, but that gets into a technical argument in a whole bit. Anyway, the point of all this is the problem facing Luther and all of his followers, which was a huge problem when you start to think about it. Once you break from Rome, once you go your own way, what do you do? How do you organize matters? How do you arrange matters and structure the church? I've stressed, and I'll stress again, that part of the process was the emergence of state churches in terms of the Reformation. And I'll be talking about later about the impact that that had and the effects that that had. In some ways, this is the first, probably the first beginnings of building up that argument, but we'll get there when we get there. But it intended, how do we organize parishes? And I've referred to that before, talking about the communal Reformation, which Luther too was supportive of communities organizing themselves, as long as they're doing it in accordance with his positions. That was always the key for Luther. He knew that he had the truth, and any deviation therefrom was wrong. So as long as you were proceeding to organize matters in keeping with his positions, everything was fine. If you didn't, then you were outside the pale and were wrong and needed to be combated against. But that's part of this. Anyway, so the whole point, again, as I've now said repeatedly for the past 10 minutes or so, is how do we affect individuals' hearts, minds, and souls? How do we change individuals' beliefs and actions? In education, in terms of formal education, which I'll be addressing shortly, and catechesis, the more general teaching, were the means to do so. We have to get people out there. Pastors were teachers. That was part of their function. And we'll see next week or the week after with Calvin that pastors and teachers were two distinct offices. But with Luther, they're almost one and the same. So we go from priest, priests in the hierarchy, the ecclesiastical hierarchy of the medieval Christendom system, and remained in the Roman system, to a hierarchy of authority based on Luther and Wittenberg and the theologians, and then trickling down from there to the individual parishes, where you have pastors who were teachers, state employees, because all of a sudden that's how they ended up being organized, even though they could then provide for their own employment of pastors. Individual communities could, based on their own revenue, so it wasn't completely nationalized, so to speak, as it was later to become at this point. So it's really an issue then of how do we transform people, because you're still dealing with the first generation, people who grew up in the old system with the sacramental system and the whole bit. Now we'll see too shortly that Luther had three sacraments, basically: baptism, the Eucharist, and confession. The rest of the Protestant tradition basically got rid of confession as well. But that all of a sudden changes how you view things. It is an upsetting situation to be in when what you have been taught all along, you find out and are now being told is wrong, and we have to change how we do things. Human beings are, in so many ways, are creatures of habit. I don't know what any of your church backgrounds are, if any at all, or religious backgrounds are, if any at all. Mine is very kind of strange and diverse, but I know that it was. I grew up going to a small Presbyterian church in Central California, and there I remember several major issues, all dealing with change. Whether it was having to find a new pastor was always a major problem, to the new hymnals. That was when I was pretty early on. They wanted to get new hymnals, and people just refused. And people left. Some of the people left the church over things like that, because it was a change that was something that they were all of a sudden uncomfortable with, and implied therein was what they had been taught was wrong. So the issue is then, how do you overcome that resistance? How do you instill a new understanding? That was the problem facing Luther and his movement, as together with the administrative, the financial, the legal problems involved, what do you do with the church property when you appropriate that from the bishop? How do you go about handling things? Now, we'll see later that you know, the Lutheran tradition certainly still maintained bishops, and so, but we'll get there before long. Anyway, that's kind of a long introduction to the setting for this lecture and what we're talking about, because in some ways, the proper perspective on the content of this lecture, not that this hasn't been content, but I hope you know what I'm getting at, is almost more important than the specifics of the content itself, because I will be talking about details and some specifics, but unless we put that in the broader perspective, we won't have that the basis for understanding what was really going on behind these efforts. We're not talking about let's now create a Sunday school and have everybody go to Sunday school. Isn't that nice? When we talk about education in the church, we'll talk about education in the church, but that's in the context of this broader context of filling this void once we exclude everything that had been before. And it's a problematic, it's a problem. It's a real problem. Um, and it caused anxiety, fear, uncertainty, um, and the whole endeavor, as I'll be mentioning towards the end of this lecture, can only be said to have been not very successful. We'll get there when we get there. All right. That being said, we move along then to the first slide after the introduction, Luther's Catechism, a new approach. Now, there you will see we start again back with late medieval catechesis. And I've talked about it before. I referred to it already in the introduction, that it was not as if there had not been attempts to teach people before, because there certainly had been. And there was a general sense um, of what people were expected to know. And they were expected to know a number of things. I've already mentioned the four basic texts they're supposed to know. The Creed, the Our Father, the Ave Maria, and the Ten Commandments. They're also supposed to know the responses at Mass. They're supposed to know the forms. When you go to confession, what do you say? Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. What is your sin, my child? How long has it been since your last confession? They need to know those formulaic responses. And that's just to participate. I mean, it's kind of that introductory, basic level of understanding. But it was not formalized. It was not institutionalized. It was intended for parish priests to help their parishes by preaching on these topics. I think I mentioned that Jordan's lectures that he gave in Erfurt, the origins of his exposition on the Lord's Prayer, he also then later included in his model sermon collection, which was intended then for parish priests to say, I mean, Augustinians obviously at the time too, to say, okay, now for the sermon today, we're going to look at Matthew, I don't know, 6, 8 to 13 or whatever it is. I forget off the top of my head the reference for the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6 in any case. And so I'm going to be lecturing on that biblical text, which we know as the Lord's Prayer, and this is what we go through it. And that is the means to teach people. Sermons had a teaching function, not simply an exhortatory. Oh, why can't I say that word? They weren't simply to exhort people and challenge people to live better lives. They're also intended to teach. And that was one of the major functions of the sermon. And especially in the later medieval period, as the sermon became more and more important and more emphasis was given to the sermon, that was based on this pastoral endeavor to catechize the congregation, to teach them the basic principles of their faith, of their belief. Luther, though, comes along and very much was aware of that tradition. It was the tradition he grew up in, so to speak. But then it's like, okay, we need to do something different because we have this void, we have this hole, and we actually don't have a great deal of time to initiate a new program. So we better hurry up and figure out a way to make this kind of fast forward it to get it to work and to get it to click. And in some ways, this was one of Luther's most ingenious works, was his small catechism. I believe the date is 1525. I would have to look that up. I'm sorry. I should have done that. I believe it's 1525 or so, but in the mid to later 1520s in any case. Maybe even earlier. Anyway, sorry. Um, and it's a new genre of literature. There had been no such thing as the catechism until Luther writes the small catechism. And you'll be reading that. And what you'll see there are a few things. Number one, it's all based on question and answer. Now, I talked about the scholastic method being one about question, um, arguing two parts to a side and coming up with a resolution. That's not the approach taken here. The approach taken here is the leader, the teacher, I'll return to that shortly. The leader, the teacher of the catechism, for the person who's being catechized, being taught, being educated, asked those people questions, and they were to memorize answers. So it was very much of a way to say, okay, here's the question. There is a set answer. It's given to you. You have to memorize that. And what is the test going to be? It's going to be based on have you memorized those answers? It's not an issue of what do you think about it? What does it mean to you? None of that is included in the catechism. It was not about, tell me how this relates to your personal relationship to God. None of that. It is simply rote memorization, repeating the answers that are given to you. Now, I have up there too, I have questions, memorization and indoctrination. Indoctrination is a term that can have negative connotations. It's along the lines of ideology and propaganda. It is a sense of somehow instilling positions, doctrine in individuals. That's what indoctrination is. And in many ways, whether people would agree with me with this because it has that negative connotations, but public education is indoctrination. We are trying to teach you things. And who determines what is taught, especially at the lower levels? Local school boards, state school boards, the university, the academic freedom of professors had always reigned supreme, but there's still the oversight of the Board of Trustees for public universities, or let's say the political and or religious programs of private universities. Even though professors still today enjoy, but for the most part, even though it's being infringed upon increasingly so, but for the most part still have academic freedom, which means, I could teach you anything I wanted, basically. I'm supposed to be responsible in that. And I must be responsible in that. And is there oversight in terms of what I teach? Yes, there is. There are the student evaluations. There are what's called the faculty annual reviews that we have to submit to our department, and then they go to the dean of the school. So there's a whole process to make sure that we are doing our jobs appropriately. But it's not based on, well, that's too liberal of a slant, or that's too conservative of a slant, or that's not really correct. We are the experts in our own areas and fields. So the whole point is that indoctrination is still a part of the university because we do have things like what? General education requirements that you have to fulfill. That is indoctrination. Indoctrination when there is an enforced, by coercion, to some extent, learning of specific things. Now, that being said, this catechism became an instrument, Luther's catechism became an instrument for indoctrinating the next generation, let's say the first generation of evangelical Christians, of the not yet, but we're become Protestant Christians and Lutheran Christians. It was a means of instilling the basic doctrines of the faith, of Luther's theological positions, quickly, effectively, and securely. Because once you memorize something like that, especially at a younger age, it sticks with you. And that is what this program was about. And you, obviously, as I said, will read his new catechism. And that's part of the whole point to the catechesis. And you'll see how it all worked, so to speak, simply by reading it and thinking about it within this broader context. Now, the focus of the teaching for Luther was the head of the household, or the father. And here, family in the Bible. And that was the same way with the Bible. So this brings us back to the question that I addressed previously in terms of sola scriptura, mentioning that for Luther, that is one of the slogans that's always associated with Luther's program. Faith alone, by grace alone, and by Scripture alone. Sola Scriptura, though, as I argued, both in terms of Luther's own translation and then also with the images, was never sola. It was never alone. It was always with Luther's slant on it and Luther's take on it. And that was what was to be read. It was not to be reflected upon. It was not to be argued with or debated. It was to be learned. Not so much memorized. You weren't supposed to memorize the Bible as such. If you did, it was great. Excuse me. But it was not a position of everybody can read the Bible for themselves and get what they want out of it, and that's valid. Absolutely not. That led to the horrors for Luther of the Peasants' War, when people start thinking on their own and interpreting the Bible on their own without any knowledge or basis of doing so, without any training. Because interpreting the Bible is extremely difficult. You have to be a scholar to do so, to even begin to do so, in Luther's view, adequately. The common person cannot interpret the Scriptures. The common person can have a personal relationship with the Scriptures, but they cannot claim that they know what the Scriptures say or mean. And that was Luther's whole point. We have to teach that from the translation itself and how I, Luther, have set it up. And even the words I use for the translation, which he also sought his help from his Wittenberg colleagues. The whole point was to have it be effective as an instrument to learn for the common people. And it was in German. And he often used language from the common people. He didn't sit in his, in the Wartburg and start saying, okay, what is the best, most elegant German word for this Greek term? It was translating primarily the Vulgate, as I mentioned in Address 2, and doing so that people could grasp it and understand it in their own language. And that's one of the things that makes his translation such a brilliant literary work, if for nothing else. Literary work is indisputably a brilliant piece of literary work. But again, it was not simply to say, okay, now everybody can read the Bible, thank God, and then go on their own way. It was, here I am also telling you how to understand what you're reading. And if you don't understand it in the way that I say, that's the problem. And the catechism was designed to help that too, to ensure that. Because once you learn the basic positions, that helps you understand the Bible as such. So that's kind of the focus. And the focus of catechesis was, sorry, I guess I'm kind of have a cold coming on here with on top of my recovery from my gallbladder surgery. The focus was on the household and the father as the central figure. When you read the catechism, you'll see it's addressed to the father. The father of the household is supposed to be asking questions of his children, and if need be, of his wife too. That was the idea. I'll be addressing something called patriarchy in a second. But that is really the focus of the catechesis. The idea behind all of this was that the role of the father in the household became of central importance for the entire Reformation program because of this function. And that meant, too, the father had to be educated enough, trained enough to be able to teach and to understand what it was he was teaching and the function of that teaching. That was important. Therefore, too, the father was expected to be literate. Now, literacy levels at this time were very low. and they remain very low. They're increasing a bit. Um, Especially among the, I mean, nobility was pretty much literate. The upper middle classes, and within still the peasantry, but the merchants, the bankers, the financiers, they were all literate. So it's really, this program is really gauged for, let's say, the middle to upper middle class and above, and not so much the lower classes, what we would call lower classes. I mean, as a footnote, I may have already said this, but there was no such thing as classes in a technical sense. The term class was a Marxist term of socioeconomic classes that really can't apply previous, but it's a very useful term. So as long as you know we're using a term that they were not using at the time, it can work if we can make sure we keep straight what we're doing. And so this idea of the middle classes and the upper classes can't help. And the point of this, too, is that for Luther, this program, and I'm still kind of discussing it, this program was designed for everybody, including the lower classes. But could a peasant family, and here I'm not talking about the Ordo Laborantium, the order of those who work, but of um, the real peasants, the real agricultural, rural parishes. Could it function for them if the father was not educated enough, was not literate? What to do about it? And that was recognized, um, but at least this was a start, and that was the intent. And the father had the lead role, and let's say an elevated role within the family even than previously. Now, I have up there too, under the sola scriptura, the pater familias and when fathers ruled. Now, the pater familias is just the father of the family. That role, that office, it almost became an office, almost officially an office within the whole Lutheran development. When Fathers Ruled, that I have there, is actually the title of a book by Stephen Osment. Stephen Osment was an excellent Reformation scholar. He's emeritus now. He was at Harvard. Before that, he was at Yale. He actually studied uh, with the same person I studied with, Heiko Overman, but he did so way back in the 60s. Um, so there's some kind of a relationship there. He's my academic um, older brother, so to speak, and he might be offended by that, but anyway, the point is, I could talk a lot more about Osmond, but I won't at this point. He wrote this book in the I forget when it was, late 80s, early 90s, called When Fathers Ruled, and like the emergence of patriarchy. And the book received a lot of criticism from feminist scholars um, because the underlying subtext, so to speak, was, and this was a good thing. This was a benefit for society. Whereas the feminist critique was, and has been, that the Reformation actually limited the opportunities for women. Because women used to be able, within medieval Christendom, to become true wives, daughters, that was their position, or to join a monastery and actually have a career in a monastery, or be a prostitute. And that was it wasn't. It was frowned upon, but it was somewhat accepted. I think I may have already mentioned all the inventories we have for the Council of Constance back in 1415 and what was available. They included then prostitutes. They wanted to make sure that they had enough prostitutes available. Um, anyway, that's uh, the point is, though, and I'm not taking sides here, I'm just kind of repeating what some of the academic debate was that the Reformation then restricted the opportunities for women because it got rid of the opportunity to become a nun. It cracked down on prostitution, so it wasn't simply shunned or frowned upon, but tolerated and even accepted. They were more than excluded. And so the only opportunities for women would to be a daughter or a wife. Limited. And so the idea that this whole focus on patriarchy within the Reformation as it was developing, with the father as the head of the household, in charge of the whole catechetical program, in some ways being responsible for the whole, let's say, Lutheran evangelization of the evangelicals, which were those of the Luther, the Martinianer, um, was not necessarily a positive. That was some of those critiques. So Osmond took a lot of hits, but what they did not critique or question um, was that his findings of the central role of the father were valid. It was more of the underlying, and this was a good thing. It's like, no, this was a bad thing. It was more those nuances of how he presented it that was critiqued. Because this whole institution of patriarchy obviously had been there all along, since at least ancient Mesopotamia, when warrior gods started replacing fertility goddesses. And that goes way back. So patriarchy in that sense was nothing new, but it became emphasized with the Reformation. The role of the father, of the pater familias, became emphasized and strengthened. And that was just simply the way it was. And when we see the catechism, you'll see that the role of the father was all important. So that's what I wanted to say about there, that this household, this whole program of catechesis was based on the household and the father. It was very much a home schooling by intent. And here there was, no such thing necessarily as, homeschools as we have them today. But it was recognizing that our primary education, and here I'm not talking about levels of institutionalized education, but our primary education has always been and always will be the family. We learn good and bad, positives and negatives, from our family, meaning the context in which we are raised. I'm not talking about necessarily, at least today, the biological family um, or the traditional family. Certainly in the 16th century for Luther, it was the traditional biological family of, husband, wife, father, mother, children and extended grandparents, aunts and uncles sometimes too. And the pater familias was the head of all of that. And that becomes emphasized. And that was where the schooling began and started. That was where children, you're going to start with children, you might as well start with children, um, in this new program, an attempt to bring up good Christian Lutherans, good Lutheran Christians, um, with the catechism from a very young age, start learning it and going over it, with reading the Bible to your family, with having that all be part of this education that you just imbue by living in the context in which you're living. Now, that's what I mean by homeschooling in that sense. The goal of the catechism was for confirmation. And with Luther, even though he did not consider confirmation a separate, distinct sacrament, he did consider it a confirmation of your baptism and your baptismal vows, because baptism, um, for Luther, as it always had been from very early on, was primarily intended for children. At least children, new children who were born, are to be baptized as soon as possible, basically. Obviously, if you're an adult and you convert to Christianity, you can be baptized. There's nothing prohibiting that. We'll be talking more about the issues of baptism when we talk about the radical Reformation in a couple of weeks. But so confirmation, on the one hand, was not a sacrament any longer in the Lutheran structure, but it was an essential step and an important step. That step of becoming a full adult member of the church. Now that would take place fairly early on. I'm not sure you can say, well, how old will you have to be, confirmed as a Lutheran in the new church in the late 1520s or early 1530s? I can't tell you. I can guess. I think if I had to guess, I would say probably around the age of 12 or so. So you had to publicly demonstrate before the entire congregation your knowledge of the catechism. That was the idea, that you practice it at home, you learn it at home, and then when you're ready and reach the right age, You go before the congregation, you are tested in front of the congregation, you are passed, you are confirmed, and then you are open to receive the Eucharist. That too is part of the catechism. When you look at Luther's catechism, you'll see very similar in some ways to the medieval catechetical program, the Lord's Prayer, Ten Commandments, not the Ave Maria, the Creed, and then he talks about confession as well. And he also talks about daily devotions as a separate section. There's another section in there too. I forget off the top of my head what it was. But those daily devotions are also to be done at home. And when you have that type of home education and schooling, it just then builds on then a more formal educational program once actually you do start school and a more formal educational program in your actual parish. So here we have pastors and parishes. And I said that parishes are an administrative unit. Dioceses are an administrative unit. As I think I mentioned that they go back, the term diocese. I'm not sure about parish, but diocese is a pre Christian term. It was part of the reforms, the administrative reforms of Diocletian back in the late third, early fourth century, late fourth, early oh gosh, Eric, late third, early fourth century, uh, and then became taken over by the Christian hierarchy as it was developing and emerging. Same thing with the term bishop. Episcopos just meant overseer. It was a pre-Christian term that then became a Christian term in a Christian office. So that a bishop, an episcopos, was an overseer of a number of parishes. That structure remained with Luther. That structure remained was what's called the magisterial Reformation. I'll be talking about a bit later. So even though they got rid of, let's say, the Roman content, they kept the structure. I think I've already referenced the fact that Luther was at times referred to as the Pope of Wittenberg. Um, Everything from the people who were just a little bit irritated with him at times, that still were his devoted followers, to people who were his, um, again, non-Catholics, who were his fierce adversaries, as a very negative term. But he functioned very much in that way. And the whole structure was designed to, on a hierarchical basis, to instill and indoctrinate the new generation. That's what this is all about. So we have, in terms of pastors and parishes, we have teaching going on in the pulpit. We have teaching going on outside of the Mass, and Luther still referred to it as a Mass. I did write a Mass in German. And we have a concerted effort to establish schools. And here I'm not talking about schools related to the church as such, I'm talking about local schools. Schools for the parish, that every parish should have a school to teach its students. This too is really the beginning of institutionalized education. And remember, I've mentioned that aside from the universities, at the lower levels, still throughout the Middle Ages, primarily there were, it was an informal structure. You would go, you could be educated in a monastery. There are other, I think I mentioned the Brethren of the Common Life, where Luther also went to be taught. You could also study with an individual. It was essentially there was the establishment of institutionalized education was very slow to develop. And the Reformation made it a primary point of their program to establish schools to teach students. The whole part was the pater familias has to be educated so he can teach his children, his wife if need be, and on we go. Still, it was for boys primarily. And we have Melanchthon, and also university is still, when you go to university, it's still in the 16th century, you're still pretty young. You're 15 or 16 years old, so it's still a longish process. And it's more, yeah. So it's you have to be able to be fluent in Latin when you go to university. Still in Luther's time, vernacular is only very slowly beginning to be introduced, but not very much at all in the universities and the structures and such. Schooling at the elementary level is still all done in Latin. Latin still is the basis for determining the literate from the illiterate, even though there are beginning to be inroads made with the vernacular. that is in this period of transition. So the schooling was there. Now, to school to have a school, an institutionalized school with school teacher and designated grades or levels, you also need a program. You need a curriculum. And to a large extent, he wasn't the only one, but to a large extent, that was provided by Philip Melanchthon. Melanchthon, I think I remember mentioned before, became known as the Praeceptor Germaniae, or the teacher of Germany. Not only did he write theological works, literary works, philosophical works, he also wrote basically elementary textbooks. Now, if you look at those elementary textbooks, they're pretty advanced. I mean, he'll have a textbook on physics. He has a textbook on psychology, De Anima. He has a textbook on rhetoric. He has several textbooks on logic. He also wrote grammars, a grammar for Latin and a grammar for Greek. And there, not only does he go through the rules of how to learn the language, he also gives sample texts, which is very much still what a lot of grammar books in Latin do today. They'll go through a lesson, they'll give you a text to read. The texts Melanchthon chose are overwhelmingly, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly biblical texts. And so, even at that level, the level of the school, as you're learning the language yourself, you're learning it by means of the examples from the Bible. So you're learning the Bible at school, you're learning it at home, you're learning it through the catechesis, through the catechism, and all then is supposed to come together to have this educated, literate, staunchly believing Lutheran communities. Now, the problem is, how did that really work? Well, no one was really sure. So Luther Melanchthon, they said, we need to have something now that this has been going, this program, our new program of ours has been going for a little while. We need to have a check to see how things are going. Now, from his monastic background, Luther knew about something called visitations. He was responsible as the district vicar of 11 houses to go and visit the houses to see how things were going. How are the brothers actually performing? How are they living their lives? Are they following the rules? Are there, problems here in terms of discipline and order? That concept Luther then applied to the parishes in the empire, at least within electoral Saxony, primarily where he was working with his prince, because we're still in a period in the late 1520s that this was, under Frederick's protection, and the Civil War had not broken out yet, so they couldn't go all over the place. But in electoral Saxony, we'd say, okay, we'll send out a team of visitors from the university that Luther will pick, and we'll go and examine people to see how they're doing and how much they know and how much change has taken place. Well, they went. I think the first one is 1526. I think, but I can't be quite certain about that. And the results were a shock, and we have the records. It was a huge shock because Luther thought that everybody, once the truth had been revealed, would just rally to his side, and that was a shock when people didn't do that. Early on, his so-called false brethren, including the peasants. And now it was a shock that his education program and his program of the catechism and teaching and transforming people wasn't working either. People were as ignorant after this new program was introduced as they had been before. Now, I'm not saying everybody was. And that's one of the problems with um, evaluating and interpreting the visitation records, because the records, in some ways, it'd be like saying, okay, we're going to now, as historians, we want to evaluate the level of education and the functioning of students at our local high schools or elementary schools. And what do we have? We have a whole series of records of visits to the principal's office. So let's look and say, oh my God, look at how many people are not living up to the way they're supposed to. What the visitation records do not reveal is how many people did get it. They don't reveal the success, they just reveal the shortcomings. Now, we have no basis to be able to determine then quantitatively what percentage of the of the people in electoral Saxony then were not getting it compared to those who were. We have no basis really to tell that. But what we do have is that the visitation records show a significant level of ignorance and that it was not having an effect. And that was a shock to Luther. That was a shock to the Wittenbergers. What do we do about this? Except try again. Now, just as an example of how, on the popular level, I'm not talking about the upper classes necessarily, but on the popular level, what was referred to even at the time as superstition was very difficult to eradicate. Superstition is difficult to eradicate. Even today, we have our superstitions. Even if we're aware of them, we still follow them. Our rituals are, don't want to be jinxed. I have to make sure I wear the right, my right jersey, my favorite jersey on the game day so my team will win and things like that. That's all superstition. But it's part of popular culture. Now, the story of the incombustible Luther is actually from the early 17th century. It was an article written by Robert Scribner, the same scholar who had written the book For the Sake of Simple Folk that I referred to. I had analyzed all the woodcuts, from which I took a lot of the woodcuts, not for the lecture last week, but when I give this lecture in person. And the case was this. It was a small Lutheran village. I forgot where it was. And the church had burned down. It was a big fire, completely destroyed. But as the citizens then were going to try to see what they could salvage, which was absolutely really nothing, there was one piece that remained unscathed, and it was a portrait of Martin Luther. Unhurt, untouched by the fire. Everything else burned to the ground, and it was seen as a miracle. This is a miracle. This is like a saint's relic. That was Scribner's point, that idea of the saints and the relics and these magical objects that had power, whether you call it divine grace or whatever you want to call it, a power that was supernatural. That level of belief was still there with the Lutherans. And Luther still found adherence to saints and to the popes. And Luther wasn't against saints, but it's like the proper attitude towards them. He says, we're all saints. It's the priesthood of all believers, and we're all saints. So he's not saying that, Saint Sebastian should not be seen as an exemplary Christian. What he's saying is that he has no intercessory value. And we still find people praying to the saints, asking for their help, asking for their intercession. So the visitation records gave a very crushing blow to Luther's view of this is all going to work out great. Now, on the theological level, or let's say also on his own superstitious level, or on the meta world historical level for Luther, when he thought more about it, he said, well, what would we expect? The world is the devil's. The devil is out there. What we have to realize is that failure is the only thing we can expect, except for individual instances of success. That was kind of Luther's perspective once he kind of processed and dealt with the visitation records. And they didn't substantially improve over time. They did a little bit, but not substantially. So it was this sense of, okay, this is what we're facing. We're still facing ignorance. We're still facing superstition. How do we get over it? We can try to enforce as much as we can by controlling the priesthood, who is appointed to pastors as pastors in a given community. We can control it by bishops, so that the bishops, the overseers, have that structure, and we can control it by making sure that all of those people have the right theological understanding coming from Wittenberg, coming from our position. But will it be successful? Maybe, but only in part. That was the view. And that was something that Luther said, I will still work at it. Now, the last slide here is the failure of the Reformation. I have a lecture coming up either next week or the week thereafter. The whole lecture is called The Failure of the Reformation, which will probably be pretty short because I'm addressing it more here. But at least here I want to introduce it. Now, the whole failure thesis, the idea that the Reformation failed. If you read, I think this assigned reading, yeah, it is for next week. The assigned reading for next week, partly is my Luther book, is chapter 8. And chapter 8 is called The Failed Reformation, or something like that, The Failure of the Reformation. I had early argued that the Reformation of the later Middle Ages failed, and then here's like the Reformation, Luther's Reformation failed too. Um, that is not my thesis. That is, I mean, I do something new with it, and I bring more information to it, and talk about other scholars hereafter. Um, but it all started with Gerald Strauss's book of 1976 or so, or 74, called Luther's House of Learning. And Strauss was actually a professor at Bloomington, um, very prominent scholar of the German Reformation and German history. In Luther's House of Learning, he was one of the first people actually to look at the visitation records. He says, based on the ideals of the reformers, of Luther and Melanchthon, based on their ideals and what they intended, compared to what actually got through, based on the visitation records, we can only say that the Reformation failed. Now that set off a bomb in scholarship because, as I think I've mentioned, traditionally Reformation scholars have been more from the theological perspective, from the church historical perspective, crossing over into history, but never really leaving that theological church historical perspective. And the idea that the Reformation fails, like how could that be? The Reformation is what led into modernity. It got us out of this area of superstition and authority when people were all under the Pope and didn't really think of anything else and just followed what the Pope said, this tyrannical authority, which is simply accepting the rhetoric of the Protestants. As I hope I've made clear that was not the case in any way, shape, or form. But that was what they were thinking. So the idea that the Reformation failed, how can that possibly be? It was a huge success. Now, the idea was much debated and argued about. It was then discussed, kind of like along with Luther, what does success and failure really mean? Um, Strauss later wrote another article after a number of years, responding to some of the critiques of his book. And it says, basically, he just comes back to the issue of intent. If you look at what they were intending to do compared to what they actually achieved, it was a failure. The problem is those terms, success and failure. How are they measured? What do we mean by them? And then what basis is there in the evidence that's still extant for measuring success and failure? When actually, what for I think Luther, I think he would say this. I think Luther would agree with me about what I'm going to say about him. That the true measure of success is the extent to which his teachings, his positions, his theology transform the hearts and minds of individuals. How do we get at that for the 16th century? We say, how do we get at that today? We could look at almost any church organization, any denomination, any individual church, and look at their official teachings and their what they advocate in their positions, doctrinal positions, and then we could examine and talk to and interview members of that individual church and see how many of them follow completely the teachings of the church. And I think that would be, kind of astounding to see the discrepancy still today. That's not based on education necessarily at all. I'm not going to go into theologically what that might be based on, but we can say it's based on individuality here, based on almost a learned skepticism against the powers that be within church structure and hierarchy. Um, but that's a whole different problem. But the problem was there from the Reformation. And so if we look back 400 years or 500 years, almost 500 years over, how do we really measure what was in the hearts and minds of people? And Could there be a level of success that was completely unnoted or unrecorded? Absolutely. I already said the visitation records don't record the successes. They only record the failure and the more outstanding failures at that. This brings us then to the question of the whole meaning of the term Reformation. We can talk about failure and say what constitutes failure or success, but then we also have to come back and say, okay, the word Reformation, what really does that mean? I've problematized that from the beginning. It's going to be problematized even further. What is Reformation? What did it mean to whom? At what time? And for Luther, I think he would agree. And I'm speaking for him. I mean, I'm not saying what I think, but I'm speaking for what I think Luther would say. Is that true Reformation is a reformation of the individual, which is going back almost to the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. It's transforming the hearts and minds of people, but with a theology that was new, with structures that were new, with organizations that were new, with educational programs that were new. All of those things are good and needed and necessary. But when it comes down to it, it's what do we, how are people affected by it? How has the gospel changed people? And that is difficult to determine. And this also then applies or has consequences for your final exam. Because if you've looked at the final exam yet, the question is, was the Reformation a revolution? Which also is a position that Steve Osmond put forward, just as a footnote here. And there you're going to have to deal with the question, well, what constitutes a revolution? Here's a little key for that coming up. What constitutes a revolution? Is it simply a political revolution? And to what extent was the Reformation a political revolution? Well, there's certainly some aspects thereof. Was a revolution of concepts and ideals and worldviews? Certainly there was some there, I think. Was it a revolution of social structures? And there I would say absolutely not. What constitutes revolution? Because before you can analyze whether or not the Reformation, as we've been discussing it all semester, and as we will continue to discuss it until May, was or was not a revolution, you need to be very clear with what you, how are you using the term revolution? What does it refer to? Can you use it in different ways? Obviously, if you're clear about it. So you can't say the Reformation was a revolution with respect to A, B, and C, but was not with respect to D, E, and F. That's up to you. You can make it what you will, or you can say that overall, no, it wasn't. Or you can say overall, yes, it was. Or you can say that even the question is misplaced. You can make the question what you will, but you're going to have to deal with the concept of revolution, and you're going to have to deal with the concept of reformation. What was it? What does the term signify? And that's what this lecture 2 is about when we come down to it in terms of Luther's intent. His intent was for the gospel to transform the heart and minds of people. How is that measured? How do we determine success or failure with something like that? That's the issue. It's also important to know that the structures, the intended parameters for what we should do are never the same as what is actually done. We have to take that into account too when we follow the Reformation. And we'll see next week Calvin's attempt to do that in Geneva. And in some ways, he was far more successful than was Luther in electoral Saxony in terms of achieving conformity. But it was a bitter struggle and never complete either, even in Geneva. But that is another story. But with Luther, it's a mixed bag. The last piece of writing we have from Luther is a handwritten note found at his bedside. It goes something like this. To understand Virgil, you would have to, spend 1,000 years living through all the things that he lived through and all the other poets and all the other authors all the way through. To understand, Paul, you'd have to be one of the disciples walking with Jesus and everything else. Basically, it's an impossible task. Now, I don't have that much, but this last part is very much true because he puts up this problem of understanding in the past, understanding what the scriptures are about. He said, how can we understand the scriptures? You'd have to live through all the lives of the prophets, of the patriarchs, of the evangelists. He ends up saying, we are beggars. This is true. And in so many ways, as historians, looking back at the Reformation, whatever that means, or looking at any period in the past, I'll leave the present out of it for the moment, we all have that feeling. We are beggars. We can know only so little, if anything at all, and we have just a very small glimpse into the lived understanding and reality of people in the past. That's the struggle. But it's an endeavor that we cannot avoid because it's an endeavor about understanding and coming to an understanding of who we are. Therefore, the importance of the Reformation. Thank you very much.